All right, well, hey everyone, welcome back to the HC Conversations podcast. I'm Phil,
I'm Paul.
and if you don't know, this is a podcast where we just sit around and talk about kind of the intersection of the Christian faith and culture and life and whatever is going on. We are two pastors in a small town in Ohio, and no idea who we're talking to, probably mostly people from our church, but if you're not, hello.
Hey.
What we got for today, Paul?
Welcome. Thanks for listening. So today we are talking about, or looking at the question, how can we trust our New Testament? Like, how do we know that it's reliable, the source material, stuff like that? Because I think that's something that people in our church are wondering, but also people outside of our church are wondering. Like, how do we know that, like, what we have today is actually what Jesus intended to say or what the disciples actually wrote down and it wasn't changed over time?
Right, because it's a common criticism that you'll hear is that, oh, well, the Bible is just like a giant game of telephone.
Yep.
You guys remember the game telephone you were played as a kid? Where, like, you play in class, the teacher whispers some statement to, like, the first kid, and then they whisper it to the next one and the next one and the next one. And by the time that you get to the end, it's like, my grandma ate a pink shoe for breakfast with pepperoni or something like that. Like that. I was just, I don't know why
That was really
I don't
good
know
off the cuff.
why those are the first things that popped into my head. And so the idea is, well, that's basically just what the Bible is, right? I mean, the New Testament specifically that we're going to talk about today. 2,000 years of, the telephone game. Certainly we don't have the original. And maybe that's a question that you have. Or maybe, you said, like, people in our church are wondering, people in community are wondering. And a lot of times, like, people who maybe we'll say are a little more hostile or antagonistic towards faith will use as like a reason for why. Well, you believe that old crazy thing.
Right. So why do you follow the Bible? I mean, Jesus was a great teacher and he had some good things to say, but we don't really know that he really lived, and we don't really know that he said any of that stuff. Right.
And so maybe a quote to kind of sum up the popular version or view of the Bible. So this is from the author Dan Brown in his book The Da Vinci Code, which was a really popular book, got even more popular when it became the movie with Tom Hanks. I always want to preface this, like, people like it is a work of fiction, right? Like the genre, it fits in the fictional genre, but we're like, no. But this is what a character in the book says, talking about the Bible, that man created it as a historical record of tumultuous times, and it has evolved through countless translations, additions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book. So basically, it was something that was kind of like a coping mechanism for man to understand the world when we were more primitive, and it's just evolved over time, and it's not really anything we should pay attention to as modern people.
An actual original.
Right. So what do you think about that? What are we going to do with that? What are we going to do with it, Paul?
That's a really interesting statement that we're going to dive into today, that actually we're going to get to in the second half of our conversation. But we're going to start off by talking about some of the other famous historical works that nobody questions the veracity of those works. So looking at Herodotus, his work was written between 488 and 428 BC. And we've got 8 copies. The earliest copy is from 8900. There's about a 1,300-year gap between when he wrote and the first copy that we have. And again, we only have 8 copies, which nobody questions what Herodotus wrote and what we find in those writings today. Everybody's like, okay, this is true. Same with Thucydides, same thing. Tacitus wrote about AD 100. The earliest copy that we have is from 1,000 years after he wrote, and we only have 20 copies. So we're getting more copies as time goes on. Caesar's Gallic Wars, about 58 to 50 BC. There's a 950-year time lapse between when he wrote and when we actually have manuscripts, fragments, full manuscripts. And we only have 9 to 10 copies of Caesar's Gallic Wars. Same with Livy's Roman History, 900 years between whenever he wrote and the first manuscripts we have, and there's 20 copies, but everybody's probably heard at some point in history class about the Livy's Roman History and his work, and we trust that as reliable. But whenever it comes to the New Testament, we question the veracity of those documents.
Right. So if you put together some of those authors that Paul just mentioned, specifically Thucydides, Herodotus, Livy, Tacitus, and Suetonius, those 5 people give us pretty much every bit of information we have on like the classical world. So like Greco-Roman culture and history. everything we know, everything you've probably pretty much learned in a history class or in a college course or, on a History Channel, Discovery Channel. Well, not that those are always the best sources of information, but everything pretty much comes from those five guys. And I think the earliest one is like 300 years after. Mm-hmm. And the total, if you total them all up, there's about 400 manuscripts. And so I think we mentioned that because like this is the same time period, in like the same, even really the same area of the world that the New Testament is born out of. Right. So this is like our comparative. This is like the control. This is the test that we're comparing it to. So yeah, it's just interesting.
Right, and this isn't stuff that we're just making up to support our case. This is actual history that you guys can Google this if you're not sure and confirm what we've just told you.
Yep, and that's all. Those are all great sources of information, right? Yeah. Like all those ancient authors from antiquity, like they're very, very reliable. Mm-hmm. So what then do we say of the New Testament?
Well, the New Testament blows all these other documents out of the water, and just sheer number, the amount of time between when these things were written and the first manuscripts that we have. So just to give you a number, we've got over 5,000 Greek manuscripts.
Okay, so the original language that the New Testament was in Greek.
Was in Greek.
So there's 5,000 just in Greek.
We're compared to the 400 out of all those other works. We've got over 10,000 Latin translations.
Yes, because the time this stuff's being produced is like that transition of the common language going from Greek to Latin is shortly down the road. When specifically it really takes off when the capital of Rome goes from Rome to Constantinople, I believe. Like that's when Latin kind of crosses over. So within a couple hundred years, everything starts being produced in Latin. So 10,000?
10,000
in Latin.
And 9,300 other languages.
Yeah, lots of other ancient languages.
Manuscripts from other languages.
Like Syriac and Coptic, and those are like the only two that I can think of off the top of my head.
Aramaic, maybe.
Old Church Slavonic. Fragments. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff in there.
And so out of those documents date from anywhere from 30 to 310 years after the time that the events of the New Testament took place. So a really short amount of time, we have a mountain of manuscript evidence.
As I came across in my research too, I thought this was super fascinating that like even if all of our manuscript, like our copies and fragments of the New Testament just disappeared, right? Like they were just gone. We would actually still be able to assemble the pretty much the entire New Testament just from the church fathers, because we have writings from the church fathers who quote the New Testament. You can put together all those quotes, and we have again the entire. There are over let me find it here. I think 1 million. There's over 1 million quotes from the church fathers alone of the New Testament, and some of them now certainly like the church fathers, some of them are much later. But some are very, very old or very close to the time of the New Testament. An example would be Ignatius. Ignatius died in 108, right? So like he is the very next generation after the first disciples, after the first apostles. He was actually a disciple of John. So like the Gospel of John, Revelation, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. And Ignatius quotes the New Testament over and over and over again. So it's like we have all of these different sources where the stuff is coming from.
Right, and so we can compare their writings to the manuscripts that we have and see, did they change it or did it remain the same? And it stays roughly the same. Yeah,
and that is one of the things where people come in and go, well, aren't there all these differences in the manuscripts, right? Because we're back to the telephone game. So what if we have a lot of them? Isn't it, aren't they all very, very different? Like there's a bunch of variations. And that answer is complicated.
It is complicated. Because it depends what you mean by differences. The differences could be as small as somebody put a space here where the other manuscript doesn't have a space, or somebody put some punctuation here in this Latin translation. The other ones don't have punctuation. So you count up all those those spaces and things. Yeah, those differences add up, but they don't change the overall meaning of the text.
Right. So there are over 400,000 variations. And as Paul just said, most of them don't make much of a difference. About 70% of them are spelling differences,
Yeah.
right? Like, oh, somebody spelled a word differently. Not like errors, there's just different ways to spell certain words. So, and then when you add up like the total of like grammatical things, spelling differences, different ways of saying things, over 99% of the variations between our copies, they don't matter. They don't make any kind of difference whatsoever. So, like, if you hear someone saying, well, there's all these differences, it's like, well, we need to qualify that because a difference isn't necessarily a problem. And actually, differences, because one of the reasons we have so many differences is just because there's a mountain of manuscripts.
Right.
There are so many. And one of the things that makes that really cool is that because of that, you can actually trace back where the differences originated a lot of times. And so there's also like this misconception of thinking of it like a telephone game, as if like there was only one copy, and then one person copied that copy, and another person copied the copy of the copy, another person copied the copy of the copy of the copy. But it's not. Like, we keep going back to the oldest copy, right? We're not just on a chain of copies. And so, as these New Testament documents got circulated, right, there would be a document that ended up in a particular church or a particular kind of monastery, and dozens of copies would be made off of that singular source.
Right. Not making copy from my copy, from the copy, from the copy. It's like, no, this is our standard.
Right.
We're going to make our copy, and then we're going to make another copy. And it was very painstaking to make these copies because they would start, once they got done with the page, they would start and count the number of letters, and if it was off by one, they would start over.
Yeah, and so because of that, because it's like it's not a copy of a copy of a copy, they're going back to same source material, you can actually track some of these, like where variations occur. Like, you can be like, oh, like here at this particular monastery is where this different spelling of John occurs or whatever.
Right.
And then you can trace the ones that come out of that. So yeah, it's not really telephone. It's I don't know, it's something different.
They were much more careful in copying things than what we are today. Whenever we hand copy stuff, especially even photocopying things today, if you keep making a photocopy of a photocopy, it eventually gets really faded and you can't see it really well. You have to work from the original. That's why back in the day when people made a lot of copies, they would keep the master and they'd put a note on it that said master copy, that you don't get rid of that one. You keep that one.
Keep that one so we can keep going back to that one, right? Yeah, because that's the purest one that we have. And like you said, like they would just, if they made a mistake, a lot of times they would start over. And there would also be times where the scribes would, if there's a known difference, like we have copies that have like notes in the margins. It says, here's a scribal difference right here. And so that's the thing too. A lot of times it's like, this is some sort of conspiratorial thing. They've kept it hidden from us. They're hiding what the truth really is. It's like, no, it's actually very, very public. It's very out in the open. The people that passed down the scriptures and that copied these things, they're like, oh no, we have a little difference here. This person interpreted it this way. So I think that's important to know too. No one's trying to hide anything. If we think that someone's trying to hide something, it's really just because we've not done the research.
Right.
Just because someone hasn't like blatantly put it in your face and said, see here, look, like there's this difference, doesn't mean they're hiding it. We can't always expect other people to do stuff for us. I think that's where a lot of that comes from as well. And you said, we're not good at copying things. We're just not good at transmission of information because we have information available to us all the time. Right. And so like our brains are not trained for this because we're like, oh, I'll just Google it. Just pull it up on my phone. I can just, numb my brain on Netflix for 6 hours and I forget everything that I've learned. It's like, these are people where it's like, this was ingrained in them. Like, to be like people that copy things, like for some of them, not all of them, because there were like kind of amateurs, especially in the early days of the church when this is like an underground movement. But as these original copies start getting established, these are like professionals who like, it is their job to, I'm a professional writer downer of things. Like the word was a scribe. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, for us, we think, well, I wrote a little note and I can't read what it says and I don't remember where I put it, but it was a very different world where this was like, no, this was a big deal to them.
Right. So when it comes, number one, to just the sheer number of manuscripts that were written in a short period of time after the events of the New Testament, we've got a mountain of evidence compared to other works at the same time that we don't have nearly as many, but we still consider them to be very reliable. And so because we have so many, we can really get back and see what the original author intended to say. So we know that our translations that we have of the New Testament, they're very good. They're very accurate because of the mountain of manuscripts that we have to pull from.
Yeah, and actually they continue to get more accurate, not
Right.
less, because the more archaeology that's done, the more manuscripts we discover. And there are manuscripts sitting in like departments and libraries and stuff that people haven't even looked at yet. We haven't got the date yet. We haven't got because there's a ton of scholarly work to be done on them. But the more that we get, the closer that we get to the original, because we have more that we can compare to.
Right.
And the more that we get, and you think, oh no, but what if something's going to change? Over 2,000 years of this history, nothing has changed. It's always pointed in the direction that the more we get, the more accurate it gets. Just interestingly, actually, it's making me skip ahead, but you kind of brought it up, so it made me think of
go ahead.
it. The King James, right? The 1611 KJV, and some people are still KJV only because they're like, it is the only version of the Bible that counts.
And not just King James only, but
The 1611, the authorized version. Like, first off, I'm going to get up on my little pet peeve here for a minute. So you ask them why? Like, why is this the only version that counts? Because it sounds biblical, right? It's like, just because it sounds fancy. You do know it was written in Greek, right? Like, not King James
Or
English.
there's some other conspiracies that have been brought in. But we're not going to talk about those.
Here's the 1611 KJV. When that was translated, we had 7 Greek manuscripts. 7. You just heard Paul say a little bit ago, we have over 5,000 Greek manuscripts now. So like massively more. So we're able to get more accurate, yes. But the really cool thing is when you compare like the 1611 King James to a new translation that just rolled out that's based on the most current manuscripts, they say practically the same thing. I mean, you got to do a little translation work because we don't understand King James English, but like hardly anything has changed. And so in 400 years of getting more manuscripts and translations, we realize this isn't changing. We're able to kind of nuance some things a little more. We're able to understand some things a little bit more. But from going from 7 manuscripts to 5,000, we still have a reliable like witness.
Right.
So that's just really cool. And if you're a King James person, good for you. Read a Bible that you'll actually read, right? And you'll understand. So that's my advice on that. For me, it's not the King James. Okay, yeah. So let me backtrack a little bit because the one thing we didn't touch on, we kind of talked about that they are very, very early compared to most other things of antiquity within a few decades.
Yeah, so let's talk about P52.
Yeah, I love P52. P52 is the oldest scrap of the New Testament we have. It is small. It's about the size of a credit card. And it is a fragment of the Gospel of John.
It's not a full manuscript.
Right.
It's a fragment.
There are some full manuscripts we have are close to full, but they're usually older. And that's simply because like this stuff was written on papyrus, which just disintegrates over time. So we only have scraps of these things. But you compile all of it and we end up with full manuscripts. So P52 is just a scrap. It's part of the Gospel of John. And the dating on it is what is so interesting. Because prior to this discovery, John was often thought to be much later. So German higher scholarship in the late 19th century was kind of known, like there was this textual criticism and theological liberalism that basically came out, it originated in Germany, and honestly it came to the U.S. as well and caused some divisions in the church and stuff, which is interesting. We can talk about it a different time. But basically there was this idea that that we couldn't take the Bible or like the Gospels, especially Jesus, as like literal, right? Like this is kind of this is made up, especially the Gospel of John, because John holds Jesus like in a very, very like he's the most really like blatant of the like Jesus is God in the flesh, and it was very high, very lofty. It's a high Christology, as is said. And so one particular German scholar, his name was F.C. Bauer, said this couldn't have been original. This is something the church produced after the fact. It couldn't, like the Gospel of John couldn't have been written until like AD 170 at the earliest. So, 150 years-ish after the fact. And that held sway in modern like scholarship for about 90 years until a guy by the name of Colin Roberts was looking at papyri in the John Rylands library in Germany, and he discovered P52, which is part of the Gospel of John, part of John 18. So he sends it off to the 3 leading experts in the world that date these things, and all 3 of them wrote back and said, this copy, it's a copy of John, it's not the original, should be dated no later than AD 150. AD 150 at the latest, and one said, I like a date as early as AD 190. And so originally it was like, oh, hey, we don't think John, the original, was even written till 170, and now we have a copy that's as early as 90. If we have a copy that's that early, that's most likely a few years, if not decades, after John originally wrote,
Right.
which dates the writing of John till late first century when John actually lived. And so again, we have these discoveries that actually move us back further in time, closer to the original. So P52 is awesome. It's like this is like real. This is crazy to have something that is, first of all, to have anything survive that was written from maybe the first century AD. We have hardly anything like that because again, it disintegrates. But
Right.
so yeah, it's pretty cool. It's real cool.
Right.
I love it.
So when it comes to again that question, can we trust the New Testament from our, not just our biased opinion, but also the mountain of scholarly evidence from looking at manuscript differences, to the number of manuscripts, to the dates of those manuscripts, we can accurately say, yes, we can trust what the New Testament has to say.
Yeah, from a purely like historical, scholarly perspective of like objectively, this is a good source of kind of historical data of like things that actually happened. What's interesting about that, like, so we're biased, obviously, we're pastors, like, so we believe that it's accurate, and we go a step further than that we believe it's also true, or that makes a difference. And so what we're not saying is because you can trust the New Testament, therefore you must accept what it says, or therefore you must believe in Jesus and be a Christian. It's not what we're saying. That's a separate conversation.
Right.
We go there because again, we it's accurate. We believe it's accurate, and so we believe that Jesus is the Son of God who died for sins, rose from the dead, and we're called to follow him. But that's a decision then that you've got to make, right? By looking at things like the Scriptures, by looking at the New Testament. But if there is a barrier that you have to faith, or coming to Jesus, or living out your faith, there may be various reasons for why you have that stumbling block or that barrier. But the reliability of the New Testament should not be one of those barriers.
Right. Right. And so the question then for you is, okay, what are you going to do with this information? Are you going to perhaps open up a New Testament and explore it, and just see what it has to say? Or are you going to put that on the table for a little bit later and look at some of the other questions that you have? Wherever you're at on that journey, we love to be able to help you. So, reach out to us. You can drop us a comment here if you're watching on YouTube. You can email us at info@hopecommunityonline.org if you have a question, or just show up to one of our Sunday gatherings.
Yeah, it'd be great. So I think that's all we got for today.
Yeah.
And we'll see you back here next month.
Bye.